If someone had told me 10 years ago that my life, my meticulously ordered, predictably quiet life, would be irrevocably shattered and rebuilt by Caleb Thorne, I would have laughed. Not a real laugh, but the dry, humorless sound I reserved for things that were fundamentally impossible, like rocks floating or the sun rising in the west. Caleb was a force of nature, a granite cliff face I was tasked with navigating, not a man I was supposed to love. My world was one of maps and compasses, of barometric pressure and the subtle language of the wind. I was the navigator for the Summit Ridge Search and Rescue Team. My job was precision. It was quiet calculation in the face of chaos. I lived in a small, neat cabin at the edge of the national park, a place where every book had its spine aligned and every mug hung facing the same direction. Solitude was not a burden, it was a carefully constructed fortress. And Caleb was the battering ram. He was our lead climber, the one who went over the edge, the one who faced the sheer rock and the screaming wind with a kind of grim determination that looked, from a distance, like arrogance. He was all broad shoulders and corded muscle, a physical presence that seemed to take up more air than anyone else in the room. His hands were calloused maps of past struggles, his jaw was perpetually set, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, rarely met mine. He didn't speak much, he acted. He moved with an economy of motion that was brutally efficient, whether he was coiling a rope or shrugging on his heavy pack. To me, he was a collection of loud noises in my quiet world. The clomp of his boots on the headquarters' wooden floor, the sharp, metallic click of his carabiners, the low, rumbling timbre of his voice when he gave short, clipped reports over the radio. I observed him the way I observed a weather front moving in, a phenomenon to be understood, predicted, and kept at a safe distance. There was no warmth between us. There was professional respect born of necessity. I trusted him not to fall, and he trusted me to get him to the right place to do it. It was a stark, functional symbiosis, and for years that was enough. My feelings were a secret territory, a hazardous landscape I never charted for anyone else. I kept them locked down, buried under layers of routine and logic. But a secret longing is a persistent thing. It's a low hum beneath the floorboards, a vibration you can feel in your bones even when the house is silent. Watching him, so alive and so impossibly distant, was a form of exquisite private torture. He was everything I was not, physical, decisive, fearlessly present in his own body. I was a ghost in a machine, a mind that piloted a body I barely paid attention to. The distance between us was more than just personality. It was a canyon. He was the sun-baked rock on one side, and I was the cool, shaded forest on the other. We saw the same sky, felt the same wind, but our feet were planted in different worlds. And I was convinced that was how it would always be. A fixed point on my map, an uncrossable chasm. Then the call came in. Hiker lost off-trail near Dragon's Tooth, a notoriously treacherous ridge. A storm was brewing, a nasty one, moving faster than the initial forecast. The kind of storm that turned the mountains into a frozen hell in under an hour. We had a small window, a desperately small window. The disruption began subtly. A change in atmospheric pressure, a darkening of the sky. The routine of gearing up was the same, but the air in the ready room was different, tense. Caleb was already there, checking his harness with sharp, angry tugs. He hated chasing a storm. He saw it as a personal insult from the mountain. "You got a route, Elias." His voice was gravel, not a question, a demand. "The west approach is fastest, but it's more exposed if the storm hits early," I said, my voice quiet, a stark contrast to his. "The eastern ascent is sheltered, but it'll add 30 minutes. He grunted, staring at the topographic map on the wall as if he could intimidate the mountain into compliance. "West, we go west, we'll beat it." I didn't argue. Arguing with Caleb was like arguing with an avalanche. You just got out of the way, but a knot of unease tightened in my gut. This was different. This was a gamble. And my life was built on avoiding gambles. We were forced together, not just on the mission, but by the clock. The ticking of it was a physical thing, a frantic heartbeat counting down. We moved fast, the two of us and two other team members, a small, efficient unit against the vast indifference of the wilderness. I was in my element, reading the terrain, calling out bearings, my mind a cool, calm sea of data. But every time I looked up, Caleb was there, a dark shape against the graying sky, pushing the pace, eating up the ground with long, powerful strides. The wind picked up, a low moan that grew into a piercing shriek. Sleet began to fall, tiny needles of ice that stung any exposed skin. We found the hiker, a young man, terrified and hypothermic but miraculously uninjured, huddled in a shallow rock alcove. The relief was a brief, warm flash in the freezing air. Then the reality of our position crashed down. The storm was on us, not coming, it was here. Getting back down the west face was suicide. My alternate route, the longer, sheltered one, was our only option. But it meant a dangerous traverse across a scree field to reach the trailhead where the rest of the team was waiting. Caleb took the lead, securing a line for the hiker. He moved with that same infuriating confidence, planting his feet as if he were welded to the rock. I was a few yards behind him, helping guide the shivering hiker when I heard it, a sharp crack followed by a low, grinding rumble. It wasn't a full-blown rock slide, just a section of the slope loosened by the rain and freezing temperatures giving way, a cascade of rock and icy mud. It happened in seconds, a blur of motion, a shout cut short. When the dust and debris settled, Caleb was down. He was 20 feet below where he'd been standing, tangled in his own rope, one leg bent at an angle that made my stomach clench. The world, for a moment, went silent. The storm, the wind, the panicked breathing of the hiker, it all faded away. There was only the sight of Caleb, the immovable man, brought down. My carefully ordered world didn't just crack, it exploded. We were miles from help, trapped in a blizzard, and the strongest man I knew was broken at my feet. The fortress I had built around my heart was instantly, violently breached. I was no longer an observer. I had to act. I had to go to him. My training took over. A cold, blessed numbness that pushed the panic down. I secured the hiker, got the other 2 team members to start setting up an emergency shelter, and then I rappelled down to Caleb. Every foot of rope was a lifetime. He was conscious, his face pale and slick with sleet. He was trying to push himself up, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles straining in his neck. "Don't move," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. His stormy eyes found mine, and for the first time I saw not arrogance but a raw, animal pain mixed with sheer disbelief. "My leg," he gritted out. "It's wrong, I know." I knelt beside him, my hands hovering over him, suddenly unsure. This was Caleb, the man I had only ever seen from a distance, and now I had to touch him. I had to assess the damage. My professionalism was a thin shield against the sudden, terrifying intimacy of the moment. His gaze was locked on me, searching, questioning. He was the one who was supposed to be in control, and now he was helpless. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted. He was vulnerable. And I, the quiet navigator, the man of maps and numbers, was the one who had to hold it all together. I took a breath, the icy air burning my lungs. There was an old ranger cabin a quarter-mile east. A dot on my map I'd memorized years ago. It was our only chance. The long night had just begun, and we were going to spend it together. Getting him to the cabin was a brutal, slow-motion nightmare. We fashioned a makeshift splint for his leg and half-carried, half-dragged him through the deepening snow and relentless wind. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone, and he grunted in pain with every agonizing step. I was close to him, closer than I had ever been. My shoulder tucked under his arm, his body leaning heavily against mine. I could feel the heat of him even through our thick layers of gear. I could smell the scent of wet earth, pine, and something that was uniquely him. It was overwhelming. The cabin was small, a single room with a stone fireplace and 2 rickety bunks. It was a haven. We got him inside, settled him on one of the lower bunks, and worked to get a fire going. The other team members and the rescued hiker huddled on the far side of the room, giving us space, creating an unintentional bubble of privacy around Caleb's pain. Once the fire was crackling, casting a flickering golden light across the rough-hewn walls, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a raw, humming awareness in its place. I had to look at his leg. Properly. "I need to cut your pants off," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the small space. Caleb just nodded, his eyes closed, his face a mask of exhaustion and pain. I took out my trauma shears. The sound of the fabric tearing was loud, violent in the quiet cabin. I peeled the wet material away from his skin. The injury was bad, a compound fracture of the tibia. Bone, stark and white, was visible against the bruised and swelling flesh. My stomach turned, but I forced the reaction down. This was my job. I was the medic. I had to clean it. I had to splint it properly to prevent more damage. I opened my medical kit. My hands were shaking slightly. I took a deep breath. I could do this. I had done this before, but never on him. I began to clean the wound. My touch was as gentle as I could make it, but he still hissed in pain, his whole body going rigid. "I'm sorry," I murmured, my focus narrowing to the task at hand. But I wasn't just focused on the wound. I was aware of everything. The texture of his skin under my fingertips, the dusting of dark hair on his leg, a long, thin scar that ran diagonally across his knee, a relic of some past battle with gravity. These were details I had no right to know, intimate geographies of a man who had always been a distant continent. He didn't speak. He just watched me. His gaze was heavy, intense. I could feel it on the back of my neck, on my hands. He was observing me the way I had always observed him. The first touch that wasn't strictly medical was an accident. I reached for a roll of gauze and my hand brushed against his. His skin was warm, surprisingly so. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. It was like grabbing a live wire. My breath hitched. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic trapped bird. I risked a glance at his face. His eyes were wide, and I saw a flicker of something in their stormy depths. Surprise, confusion, it was gone before I could name it. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to focus. "Almost done," I said, my voice a strained whisper. I worked quickly, my movements becoming clipped and efficient, a desperate attempt to rebuild the professional wall that had just been vaporized by a simple, unintentional touch. When I finished, his leg was cleaned, bandaged, and secured in a proper splint. I gave him a high dose of the painkillers from my kit. He lay back against the thin mattress, the tension slowly leaving his body as the medicine began to work. The others were asleep, their quiet breathing a soft rhythm in the room. The storm raged outside, a wild, elemental fury that sealed us in. It was just the two of us awake in the firelight, the silence stretched, thick and heavy. It wasn't the comfortable silence of my cabin. It was a silence full of unspoken things, a physical weight in the air between the bunks. "Elias." His voice was low, slurred slightly by the painkillers. I looked over at him. His eyes were open, fixed on the wooden ceiling. "Yeah, thanks." It was just one word, but it felt momentous. Caleb Thorne did not say thank you. He just did things and expected others to do the same. "It's my job," I said, deflecting. He turned his head on the lumpy pillow, his gaze finding mine in the dim light. "No, not just for this." He gestured vaguely with his hand. "You're always there, quiet, watching everything." "I see you." My stomach filled with a swarm of nervous bees. He sees me. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. I had cultivated invisibility around him, and it had been a complete failure. "You're the one everyone watches, Caleb," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. It was too honest, too vulnerable. A strange, sad smile touched his lips. "They watch the climber. They don't see the man who's scared of falling." The confession hung in the air between us. It was a crack in the granite facade, a glimpse of the man behind the myth. He was admitting a weakness to me. The ground beneath my feet felt fundamentally unstable. The man I had defined by his fearlessness was admitting to fear. "Everyone's scared of falling," I said softly. "Not like you think," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm not scared of the drop. I'm scared of stopping. If I'm not climbing, if I'm not pushing, then what am I?" The question was so raw, so deeply insecure, that it knocked the air out of me. It was the same question I asked myself in the dead of night. If I'm not the navigator, the careful planner, the man of logic, then what am I? We were two sides of the same coin, defined by our roles and terrified of the emptiness without them. The power dynamic had been leveled. He was no longer the imposing force of nature, and I was no longer the quiet observer. We were just two men, trapped by a storm, stripped down to our essential fears. I didn't know what to say. The truth felt too large and dangerous for the small cabin. So I just held his gaze, and for the first time, I felt like he was truly seeing me, Elias, and not just the team's navigator. And I was seeing him, Caleb, and not just the lead climber. The distance between us, that uncrossable canyon, had vanished. We were on the same side now, huddled together in the dark. Hours passed in that strange, suspended reality. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin grew colder. I got up to add more logs, my movements stiff and slow. When I turned back, Caleb was shivering, his teeth chattering despite the thick wool blanket I'd covered him with. Shock and blood loss were taking their toll. "You're freezing," I stated, the medic in me overriding the anxious man. "I need to get you warm." The other bunks were occupied. The floor was drafty and cold. There was only one option, and the thought of it sent a fresh wave of panic through me. The space on the bunk next to him. It was a purely medical decision, a logical necessity. I told myself that over and over. Body heat was the most efficient way to combat hypothermia. It was in the training manual. It was a fact. It had nothing to do with the frantic, terrified hope that was blooming in my chest. I need to lie down next to you," I said, the words feeling clumsy and loud in the quiet room. "To share body heat." He just looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable in the flickering light. He gave a short, jerky nod. My heart was a drum against my ribs. I lay down on the narrow bunk, my back to him, trying to take up as little space as possible. The mattress sagged under our combined weight. It was awkward, clinical. But he was still shivering violently. "This isn't working," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Turn on your side, face me." The rustle of fabric as he shifted was the loudest sound in the world. He moved slowly, carefully, his breath catching with a pained gasp as he jostled his injured leg. Then he was still facing me. We were inches apart. I could feel his breath on my cheek. "Sorry," he mumbled. "It's okay." I draped an arm over his torso, pulling him closer, tucking the blanket around us both. My body screamed in protest at the intimacy, at the sheer, overwhelming proximity of him. But another, deeper part of me, a part I had starved for years, settled into a profound, terrifying calm. His shivering began to subside, replaced by a fine tremor that I could feel running through his whole body. He was solid and warm against me. My hand was splayed across his chest, and I could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart under my palm. It was a stark contrast to the wild panic of my own. The scent of him was all around me. Pine, sweat, and the faint, metallic smell of blood. It should have been clinical, but it was devastatingly personal. This was the smell of his pain, his vulnerability. We lay like that in silence for a long time. The storm howled outside, a lonely, desolate sound, but inside our small cocoon of shared warmth the world felt still. "Elias," his voice was a soft rumble against my chest. Why are you always alone?" The question was a clean, sharp blade that slipped right through my defenses. It was so direct. "So Caleb," I swallowed, the sound loud in the stillness. "It's easier," I finally said, the admission tasting like rust in my mouth. "Less variables, less chance of getting it wrong." "Getting what wrong?" he pressed, his voice gentle. "This," I whispered, the word encompassing everything. "People, feelings. It's not a map, there are no coordinates, I don't know how to navigate it." He was quiet for a moment, I could feel him thinking. "You think I do," he said, a note of self-deprecation in his tone. "I just climb." I put one hand in front of the other. I pull myself up. It's all I know. People, they're more complicated than a rock face. He was right, and in that moment I understood. His physical confidence was a shield, just as my intellectual solitude was mine. We were both just finding our own ways to manage a world that felt too big, too chaotic. His hand came up slow and hesitant and covered mine where it rested on his chest. His fingers were calloused and strong. They laced through mine. It was not an accidental touch this time. It was deliberate, an anchor in the storm. My breath caught in my throat. This was it, the precipice. The point of no return. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Every cell in my body, every lonely, guarded part of me, leaned into that simple, profound connection. His thumb stroked the back of my hand, a small, repetitive motion that sent shivers through me. "I don't think you'd get it wrong, Ilias," he said, his voice so low it was almost a vibration I felt more than heard. I tilted my head up, my gaze meeting his. His eyes, so often stormy and distant, were clear and close. They held a question I was too terrified to answer, and a statement I was desperate to believe. The firelight carved shadows and highlights onto his face, making him look both stronger and more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. The space between us dwindled. I don't know who moved first. Maybe we both did. It wasn't a rush. It was a slow, inevitable drift, like two celestial bodies caught in each other's gravity. His face was so close now, his breath mingling with mine. And then his lips met mine. It wasn't a passionate, demanding kiss. It was hesitant, questioning. It was unbelievably soft. It was a confession whispered in a language beyond words. It tasted of salt and cold air and a desperate, long-held loneliness. My eyes fluttered shut. My mind, my overthinking, analytical mind, finally went silent. There were no maps, no coordinates, there was only this. The solid warmth of him, the shocking softness of his mouth, the feeling of his heart beating steadily against my hand. It was the most honest thing I had ever experienced. A single, perfect point of connection in the vast, roaring chaos of the world, and it felt like coming home. The morning came too soon. It arrived not with sunlight, but with a gradual lessening of the storm's fury and a pale, gray light filtering through the cabin's single grimy window. The world outside was muffled and white. The rescue team would be on their way. Reality was on its way. I woke up first. Sometime in the night we had shifted and I was curled against Caleb's chest, his arm draped protectively over me. His breathing was deep and even. He was asleep. For a few blessed, suspended moments, I just lay there, listening to the sound of his heartbeat, feeling the solid reality of him beside me. The memory of the kiss was a warm, glowing ember inside me. It felt real. It felt true. But then my mind, my treacherous, analytical mind, began to stir. It was the storm. It was the isolation, the pain, the medication. The thoughts came one after another, cold, sharp needles puncturing the warm bubble of the night. He was vulnerable, I was the medic, I took care of him. Was this just gratitude, a trauma bond forged in a crisis? The logical part of my brain presented the evidence and it was damning. It couldn't have been real. Men like Caleb Thorne didn't fall for quiet, anxious men like me. It was a fluke, a statistical anomaly in the data of our lives. The anxiety began to crawl back in, a cold, familiar tide. I carefully, silently untangled myself from him. The loss of his warmth was immediate and sharp. I stood up, my own muscles aching, and moved to the other side of the cabin. I felt like a criminal fleeing the scene of a crime. The others began to stir. The small space was soon filled with the quiet bustle of people waking up, checking gear, preparing for the trek out. I avoided looking at Caleb's bunk. I busied myself checking on the hiker, repacking my med kit, my movements precise and mechanical. I was rebuilding my fortress, stone by painful stone. When I finally had to face him, he was awake. He was watching me, his expression clouded. The painkillers had worn off, and I could see the lines of pain etched back around his eyes. The intimacy of the night was gone, replaced by a tense, awkward silence. The rescue team arrived an hour later. It was a swift, efficient extraction. They brought a litter for Caleb. As they were loading him onto it, he tried to catch my eye. I looked away. I busied myself giving a report to the team leader, my voice detached and clinical, focusing on the details of the injury, the vital signs, the treatment administered. I was the medic again, nothing more. They airlifted him directly to the hospital in the nearest town. I watched the helicopter rise, a noisy, intrusive machine in the pristine white landscape, until it was just a speck in the sky. And then it was gone. He was gone. The silence he left behind was immense. It was a vacuum that pulled at the edges of my carefully reconstructed composure. The trek back to base camp was a blur. I walked, I navigated, I did my job. But my mind was back in the cabin, trapped in the flickering firelight, replaying the feel of his hand in mine, the soft pressure of his mouth. The next few days were a special kind of hell. I went back to my cabin, back to my routine. I aligned my books. I washed my mugs and hung them all facing the correct direction. I plotted weather charts. I did everything I was supposed to do to feel normal, but my solitude, once a comfort, was now tainted. It was no longer a peaceful quiet, it was an absence. The cabin felt too big, too empty. Every creak of the floorboards was a question, every gust of wind sounded like my name. No call, no text, nothing. The silence from him was a confirmation of my worst fears. It had been a mistake, a moment of weakness for him, a moment of foolish hope for me. He was probably embarrassed. He was probably lying in a hospital bed, replaying it in his mind and cringing. The thought made my stomach clench with shame. My anxiety, which I normally kept on a tight leash, was running wild. It whispered to me in the long, dark hours of the night, "You misread everything. You took advantage of him when he was hurt. He's a hero, a man of action, and you're just you." Of course he didn't call. I shut myself off. At headquarters, I was quiet, efficient, distant. When people asked about Caleb, I gave them the clinical update. Compound fracture. Surgery went well. He'd be off the mountain for a few months. I said the words as if I were reading a weather report, cold, factual, and with no personal investment. I was a ghost again, haunting the edges of my own life. A week after the rescue, I was sitting in my cabin, staring at a map but not seeing it. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered peaks outside my window in shades of pink and orange. It was beautiful, and it made me feel absolutely nothing. A profound, hollow ache had settled deep in my chest. I had survived Caleb Thorne's presence. I wasn't sure I would survive his absence. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong, the crunch of tires on the gravel of my long, secluded driveway. No one ever came to my cabin, ever. My heart leaped into my throat. I stood up, my legs feeling weak, and went to the window. It was Caleb's truck, old, beat up, and unmistakable. My mind reeled. What is he doing here? The driver's side door opened, and he emerged. Slowly, painfully, he was on crutches, his left leg encased in a heavy cast from his thigh to his ankle. He looked tired, he looked worn out. And as he started the slow, awkward journey up my porch steps, he looked nervous. I opened the door before he could knock. We just stood there for a moment, staring at each other across the threshold. The silence was stretched thin, humming with a week's worth of doubt and fear. He looked even bigger, more substantial in the small frame of my doorway. His presence was overwhelming, just as it had always been. But his eyes were not arrogant or distant. They were full of an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. It looked like a mixture of exhaustion and apology. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice rough. I just nodded, stepping back to let him pass. He navigated his way into my small living room with a clumsy grace, the crutches thumping on the wooden floor. He finally maneuvered himself onto my sofa, letting out a long sigh as he propped his cast-encased leg up on my coffee table. He looked around the room, at my neat stacks of books, at the framed topographical maps on the wall. He looked like a mountain that had been crammed into a shoebox. "Nice place," he said, his voice quiet. "It's clean." I could feel a hysterical laugh bubbling in my chest. A week of radio silence, a week of torturous anxiety, and he starts with "nice place." "Why are you here, Caleb?" I asked, my voice coming out colder than I meant it to. The fear was making me defensive. He finally looked at me, really looked at me. His gaze was direct, unwavering. "Because you didn't answer your phone," he said simply. "You didn't call," I countered, the words sharp. "I did," he said, his brow furrowing. "Twice, yesterday." "And I texted." My blood ran cold. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I'd put it on silent 3 days ago, unable to bear the hope that flared with every junk email notification. And there they were. 2 missed calls from an unknown number, a text message. My hands trembled as I opened it. "It's Caleb, call me." It was sent 24 hours ago. A wave of nausea and self-loathing washed over me. I had been so lost in my own spiral of fear that I had manifested the very reality I was dreading. I had created the silence. "Oh," was all I could manage to say. The sound was small and pathetic. He watched me, his expression softening. "Elias, I'm sorry." "For what?" I asked, looking up from the phone, my eyes stinging. "You have nothing to be sorry for." For the silence, he said, his voice firm. They had me on so much medication the first few days, I was barely coherent. And then I didn't know what to say. I kept replaying it all in my head. The storm, the cabin. He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands. Us, he looked up again, and his eyes were raw with vulnerability. I was scared, he admitted, the words quiet but clear. I was scared that it was just a thing that happened, because we were trapped, because I was hurt. I was scared that you thought that, or worse, that you regretted it. Every fear I had harbored, every anxious whisper in my head, he had just voiced them. But he wasn't saying them because they were true. He was saying them because he had been afraid of them too. I didn't regret it, I whispered, the confession a release of a week's worth of pressure. I thought you did. A slow, weary smile touched his lips. Elias, that night, it was the first time I haven't felt like I was about to fall off a cliff in years. Being with you, it felt like being tethered to something solid. The metaphor was so perfectly him, so perfectly us, that it broke through the last of my defenses. He saw me as his anchor, me, the man who felt like he was perpetually adrift. I don't know how to do this, Caleb, I said, the honesty feeling like a leap into empty air. This is uncharted territory for me. Me too, he said, his voice gaining a bit of its old strength. But like I told you, I'm good at putting one hand in front of the other. We can figure it out. He shifted on the couch, reaching into the pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a single, worn key on a simple metal ring. He held it out to me. My apartment is on the second floor, he said. There's no elevator. It's going to be a pain in the ass for the next couple of months. He looked at me, his expression deadly serious. I'm going to need help. It wasn't just a request for help with groceries. It was an invitation. A tangible act of commitment. A key. A promise of access, of shared space, of a future. I slowly walked over and took the key from his hand. It was cold and heavy in my palm. Our fingers brushed, and this time the jolt wasn't one of panic. It was a jolt of recognition, of rightness. Okay, I said, my voice steady for the first time in a week. Okay, Caleb. He leaned back into the couch, the tension visibly leaving his shoulders. He looked exhausted, but for the first time since I'd met him, he also looked peaceful. He was here, in my quiet, ordered space. And it didn't feel like an invasion. It felt like a completion. The missing piece of a map I never knew I was trying to solve. The next few months were a new kind of routine. My world, once solitary, now had a Caleb-shaped orbit. I spent my days at the SAR headquarters and my evenings at his apartment, a place that was the complete opposite of my cabin. It was messy, lived in, and full of the comfortable chaos of a life focused on things other than order. His climbing gear was in a heap in the corner, dishes were often in the sink, but it was warm, it was real. We fell into a rhythm. I would cook, simple meals he claimed were the best he'd ever eaten. He would sit at the small kitchen table and tell me stories about his childhood, about the mountains he'd climbed, about the fears he never showed anyone else. I helped him with his physical therapy exercises, my hands now familiar with the shape of his body, the feel of his muscles working. The touches were no longer fraught with anxiety, they were a language we both understood. One morning I was making coffee in his kitchen. He was still asleep. I moved quietly, enjoying the early morning light streaming through the window. This had become my favorite time of day, the quiet beginning before the world woke up. But it was a different kind of quiet now. It was a shared quiet, filled with the soft sound of his breathing from the other room. I felt a presence behind me, and then his arms wrapped around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. He was leaning heavily on his good leg, but he was standing. He was holding me. Morning, he rumbled, his voice thick with sleep. Morning, I replied, leaning back into his embrace. His warmth enveloped me. It felt safe. It felt like home. We stood there for a long time, just watching the coffee drip, the silence comfortable and easy. My heart, once a frantic trapped bird, was calm. It beat in time with his. I thought back to the man I was before the storm. The man who lived in a fortress of solitude, who navigated the world through maps and logic because he was terrified of the messy, unpredictable terrain of the human heart. That man would not recognize the person I was now, standing in a cluttered kitchen, wrapped in the arms of a man who was once an impossibly distant mountain. Caleb Thorne hadn't just shattered my quiet life, he had saved me from it. He was the disruption, the storm, the unexpected variable that had forced me to redraw all my maps. He was the plot twist I never saw coming. And as I turned in his arms and met his sleepy, smiling eyes, I knew with a certainty that needed no compass or coordinates that I was finally, truly found. Our new beginning wasn't a grand, dramatic event. It was a series of quiet moments, stacking up like stones to build a foundation. It was the way he'd start telling a story and I could finish his sentence. It was the way I'd leave a book on his nightstand I thought he'd like, and find it the next morning with the corner of a page turned down. It was sleeping through the night, every night, without the cold dread of waking up alone. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for years had receded, becoming a distant echo rather than a constant roar. When his cast finally came off, the first thing he wanted to do was go for a walk. Not a hike, not a climb, just a walk. We went to a trail at the base of the mountains, a simple, flat loop around a lake. He still had a limp, and he leaned on me slightly, but his smile was blinding. He was a man rediscovering his own body, his own freedom. We stopped by the edge of the water. The lake was a perfect mirror, reflecting the snow-capped peaks and the vast, blue sky. It was the world we both loved, the world that had almost killed him, the world that had brought us together. "It looks different," he said, his gaze on the familiar ridgeline of Dragon's Tooth. "How so?" I asked. "I used to look at it and just see a challenge," he said, his voice thoughtful. "A thing to be conquered. Now I don't know, it just looks like a place. A place where I almost lost everything and ended up finding the one thing I didn't even know I was looking for." He turned to me, his stormy eyes clear and bright in the afternoon sun. "It's the place where I found you." He reached out and took my hand, his calloused fingers lacing through mine. He did it without hesitation, right there in the open, with other hikers passing by on the trail. It was a simple, public declaration. A symbolic gesture that defied a lifetime of my own hiding and his stoic reserve. My heart swelled, full and warm. The fortress was gone for good. There was just open air, open sky, and his hand in mine. That night we lay in his bed, the window open to the cool night air. The sounds of the town were a distant murmur. It was a different kind of quiet from my cabin, a quiet that was alive with the presence of other people, a reminder that we weren't isolated anymore. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his fingers tracing patterns on my back. "Maps," I said honestly. "I used to think life was about having the right map, about knowing the route from point A to point B. I spent so much time trying to chart everything, to predict every variable." I shifted, turning to face him. "You were never on my map, Caleb. You were a geological feature. A dangerous, unpredictable mountain range I was supposed to navigate around." A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. "Glad I caused a rock slide then." "Me too," I said, and the truth of it resonated in my bones. "You taught me that the most important places, the ones that change you forever, are the ones you can't plan for. They're the destinations you find only after you've gotten completely and utterly lost." He pulled me closer, his lips finding mine in the darkness. The kiss was no longer hesitant or questioning. It was deep and sure, a confirmation of everything we had found together. It was a promise of a new territory we would explore together, without maps, without fear. Just one hand in front of the other, one day at a time, together.